I need to show you something I genuinely hope never happens. But hope is not a strategy, and 20% probability is not zero. This is phase 3 of the Iran conflict, the scenario where ground troops deploy, Russia intervenes, China makes its move, and the nuclear question becomes operational. This is a probability-weighted simulation based on historical precedent, game theory, and strategic incentives of every major power positioned around this conflict. The window to prevent phase 3 exists right now during phase 2, before the machinery of escalation removes every off-ramp. A simulation is not a prediction. A prediction says this will happen. A simulation says if X occurs, then Y follows. And here's the chain of causation. What we are building is a decision tree where each branch represents a choice made by rational actors under constraints, and each choice leads to a narrower set of options for everyone else. The starting probability I assigned to phase 3 was 20 to 25%. That number comes from historical frequency analysis of similar conflicts, current force postures, domestic political pressures, and stated doctrines of nuclear powers in the theater. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 timelines leads here, and that is high enough to warrant serious examination. The trigger event for phase 3 is a casualty threshold that makes the current air campaign politically unsustainable. The most likely trigger is a successful Iranian strike on a U.S. naval vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, not a warning shot. A direct hit with significant loss of life. A destroyer carries 300 personnel. An amphibious assault ship carries over 1,000. A successful anti-ship missile strike using saturation attack could produce casualties in the range of 50 to 200 American service members in a single event. The deadliest single day for U.S. forces in Afghanistan was August 6, 2011, when 30 Americans died. A naval strike producing triple that number would be the deadliest day since the Beirut barracks bombing in 1983, which killed 2 M41. That scale of loss generates immediate demands for retaliation beyond airstrikes. It creates political pressure for ground operations, and ground operations in Iranian terrain is where phase 3 begins. The decision to deploy ground forces would come from the White House, likely over Pentagon objections. Presidents under intense domestic pressure after mass casualties do not always follow military advice. The Iraq War began over explicit warnings of Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki, who correctly predicted the occupation would require several 100,000 troops. He was ignored. History provides the template. Once decided, deployments occur rapidly. The 82nd Airborne can deploy a brigade anywhere in 72 hours. Within 2 weeks, 15,000 to 20,000 American troops would be on the ground in southern Iran, securing approaches to the Strait of Hormuz and establishing forward operating bases. The operational objective would be framed as limited, but operational objectives and strategic reality diverge when terrain dictates tactics. Southern Iran is not flat desert. The Zagros Mountains run parallel to the Gulf Coast. Iranian forces have spent 2 decades pre-positioning assets in those mountains for this scenario. Every valley is a kill zone. Every ridgeline offers defensive advantage. Urban centers like Shiraz, Bandar Abbas, Kerman are populated by civilians who will not welcome American occupation. The IRGC operates as a decentralized network where regional commanders have pre-delegated authority to continue operations, even if central command is destroyed. This is not improvisation. This is doctrine refined over 40 years. Within 30 days, American casualties would mount steadily through sustained attrition. IEDs targeting supply convoys, drone strikes on bases, ambushes in mountain passes. The daily casualty rate during the Iraq surge averaged 3 to 4 American deaths per day. In Iranian mountain terrain against a prepared defender, that number could double. 10 Americans per day, 70 per week, 300 per month. Unlike Iraq, there would be no moment where local populations turn against insurgents because in this scenario, insurgents are defending their homeland. By day 60, total casualties would exceed 600. By day 90, over 1,200. Those numbers would dominate media coverage. Cable news would run split screens showing flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover alongside footage of Iranian forces still operating. The political consensus that enabled deployment would fracture, and that is when Russia makes its move. Russian intervention would begin with weapons systems. The S-400 air defense system Russia has offered to Iran would be delivered under the justification of defending Iranian airspace against continued American bombing. Deployment of S-400 batteries would fundamentally alter the air campaign. American aircraft would face peer-level integrated air defense. Sortie rates drop. Close air support becomes dangerous. Medevac helicopters operate under increased threat. The no-fly zone America enjoyed evaporates. Russian military advisors would arrive in Tehran, officially to operate the systems and train Iranian crews. Unofficially, they would integrate Russian intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance into Iranian operations. Russian satellite data would feed Iranian targeting. Russian signals intelligence would track American movements. The effect would be significant upgrade in Iranian effectiveness without Russian soldiers in direct combat. Russia's presence creates a tripwire. Any American strike that kills Russian personnel risks direct U.S.-Russia confrontation. Putin would make this explicit through a public declaration framing the conflict in nuclear terms. The statement would be, any nation deploying nuclear weapons in the Middle East theater will face an equivalent Russian response. That phrasing is critical. It is not a threat to use nuclear weapons first. It is a threat to respond if America uses them. Paradoxically, that threat serves as both escalation and de-escalation. It escalates because it puts nuclear weapons into discourse. It de-escalates because it gives the American president a face-saving exit. We cannot use tactical nuclear weapons because Russia has drawn a red line. The external constraint allows for internal retreat. But whether that off-ramp is taken depends on what is happening simultaneously in the Pacific. China will not sit idle while America is bogged down in Iran. Phase 3 is about every adversary recognizing that American military bandwidth is finite and acting accordingly. Within 90 days of American ground deployment, China would initiate large-scale military exercises around Taiwan. Not an invasion yet, but exercises designed to probe American resolve and complicate force allocation. Pentagon planners call this the two-theater war problem. Can the United States sustain major combat in the Middle East while deterring Chinese action in the Western Pacific? The official answer has always been yes. The honest answer heard in closed-door sessions is maybe, depending on duration and intensity. If American carriers are committed to the Persian Gulf, they cannot simultaneously be forward deployed near Taiwan. If air assets are conducting close air support in Iranian mountains, they cannot be conducting freedom of navigation flights through the Taiwan Strait. China would not need to invade Taiwan to achieve strategic advantage. They would simply create conditions where Taiwan's leadership loses confidence in American security guarantees. And once that confidence erodes, the calculus changes. This is where the economic dimension becomes as dangerous as the military. China holds over $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. During prolonged conflict where American commitment to Asian security is questioned, China could quietly liquidate those holdings, not as an attack, but as reallocation away from an adversary's currency. The effect on U.S. borrowing costs would be immediate. Treasury yields spike, mortgage rates climb, federal borrowing to finance the war becomes more expensive, creating a fiscal feedback loop where the war funds itself at increasingly unaffordable rates. Simultaneously, China would accelerate Belt and Road energy partnerships, deals with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Gulf states to trade oil in yuan rather than dollars. Each agreement pulls another brick out of the petrodollar architecture. If the dollar loses its role as global reserve currency for energy, American inflation becomes structurally embedded. The geopolitical order built in 1945 starts fracturing in 2026. Now we reach the nuclear threshold. Under what conditions does an American president consider using tactical nuclear weapons? The scenario requires three conditions simultaneously. First, American ground forces must be operationally encircled with no path to extraction. Second, conventional options to break encirclement must have failed or be assessed as likely to fail. Third, domestic political pressure must be so intense that withdrawal is seen as politically fatal. If all three conditions align, pressure to escalate becomes real. Tactical nuclear weapons are not city destroyers. A B-61 bomb can be dialed to yields as low as 0.3 kilotons. Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. The military application would be striking a concentrated Iranian formation or hardened bunker deep in mountains where conventional weapons cannot reach. The logic would be to demonstrate overwhelming capability, shatter Iranian will, and force immediate ceasefire. But that logic rests on assumptions game theory suggests are false. The assumption that limited nuclear use stays limited, that Iran capitulates rather than retaliates, that Russia responds proportionally. That global reaction is manageable. History offers one data point on nuclear use in warfare: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That involved a non-nuclear adversary with no allies capable of responding. This scenario involves a regional power with state sponsors possessing thousands of nuclear weapons. The risk is not that tactical use leads to strategic exchange immediately. The risk is that it removes the taboo. Once one nation uses a nuclear weapon after 80 years of restraint, every other nuclear power recalculates its threshold. Probability of future use rises exponentially, and that is the scenario every serious strategist fears most. Not the immediate destruction, but the normalized erosion of the norm that has prevented nuclear war since 1945. What prevents Phase 3 in most timelines is rationality, cost-benefit analysis, recognition that costs vastly exceed any benefit. The United States gains nothing from occupying Iran that justifies the expenditure of blood and treasure. Iran gains nothing from killing Americans that justifies destruction of its infrastructure and economy. Russia gains nothing from direct confrontation with NATO. China gains nothing from invading Taiwan under unfavorable conditions when patience serves better. Everyone loses in Phase 3. The question is whether the machinery of escalation, once set in motion, can be stopped by rational actors recognizing mutual loss, or whether the momentum of decisions already made carries everyone past the point of no return. The historical record is mixed. Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved through rational de-escalation. World War I was not. The difference lay not in the strategic situation, but in the decision-making processes and the personalities involved. I am showing you this simulation not because I believe Phase 3 is inevitable. I am showing you this because 20% probability means that in 1 out of every 5 comparable situations, this is where we end up. And the decisions that determine which timeline we are on are being made right now. In Phase 2, before ground troops deploy, before Russia commits advanced weapon systems, before China initiates its Taiwan exercises, before the nuclear question becomes operational rather than theoretical. The off-ramps still exist. Diplomacy still has oxygen. The Strait of Hormuz can reopen through negotiated settlement rather than military invasion. Iranian leadership can choose strategic patience over tactical aggression. American leadership can declare limited objectives achieved and pursue de-escalation. But those off-ramps narrow with every day the current trajectory continues. And once Phase 3 begins, once American boots are on Iranian ground and casualties are mounting and great powers are maneuvering for advantage, the off-ramps do not widen, they disappear. This is not entertainment. This is not a geopolitical thought experiment designed for engagement. This is a simulation of a real possibility, with real probabilities derived from strategic analysis, historical precedent, and game-theoretic modeling. The purpose of running the simulation is not to frighten you. The purpose is to equip you with the map. Because informed citizens change political calculations, leaders respond to public pressure, and effective pressure requires understanding the stakes. If you are watching this and thinking this scenario seems far-fetched or alarmist, I would ask you to consider the predictions made in February 2022. How many analysts predicted Russia would invade Ukraine? How many predicted the war would still be ongoing in 2026? How many predicted NATO would expand to include Finland and Sweden? Unlikely is not impossible. Low probability is not zero. And the difference between 20% and 0% is the difference between vigilance and complacency. The time to understand Phase 3 is now, while we are still in Phase 2, and while the choices that prevent escalation still matter.